Okay, so let's conclude this with somebody shouting something. Let's conclude this with the last bit from the second edition. I have already uh, I will have another podcast on the conclusions from the first edition, and I will add a few words of conclusion from this edition as well. So you will have a double dose of conclusions, but that's okay. So what is a double design process? So in the capacity development process, finally, uh, initiatives are generally including only objectives, activities, and indicators focusing on developing the abilities of the human environment system to perform particular functions for resilience. As such, with little or no attention to the activities and results necessary for developing local ownerships, mutual partnerships, vital roles and responsibilities, trustful relationships, and other aspects essential for effective capacity development. So this way of phrasing things, saying we are building resilience for the human environment system, is very good, because everything we do affects the environment, and if we keep that in mind, then we are not going to worry only about human systems and their resilience, but to actually include environment always in our resilience planning, so that we make the human environment system location specific, local risk dependent, local vulnerability, local exposure, and local hazards, to make the entire system resilient, right? So no wonder the overall results are generally insufficient if we don't do all these things of designing for uh, you know uh, what we said just now in terms of local ownership, mutual partnership, vital roles and responsibilities, and so on. So for capacity development for resilience to work, it's helpful to approach it as a double design problem, with the first design loop focusing on designing, implementing, and evaluating sets of activities to develop the abilities of the human environment system in question to perform particular functions for resilience, and the second design loop focusing on designing, implementing, and evaluating sets of activities with the explicit purpose of engendering the preconditions necessary for capacity development to work. You understand? So we'll look at the figure here. So you have the double loop here. So you have designing capacity for designing capacity development. So in the first design loop, you develop capacity for resilience. So you focus on implementing activities and evaluating activities to arrive at the completion of the implementation of the first loop for developing capacity. In the second loop, you actually implement activities and evaluate the activities to develop the preconditions to develop capacity. Okay, so what you designed is theoretically good, but is it going to work? So you need to set up the preconditions for the developed capacity to actually work and be sustained, locally owned, with responsibilities defined and trustful relations established. Remember, we said external partners become coaches. If the team doesn't respect and trust the coach, it's not going to win games, right? It's that simple. So these preconditions require explicit attention and not just talking about them and hoping they are addressed as some fortunate byproduct of the activities of the first loop. We must include explicit objectives, activities, and indicators that directly address clear roles and responsibilities, allow time to build relationships of mutual trust, and develop the softer skills needed as well. That way, the partners in capacity development must pay real attention to its principles, get a venue for dialogue about how to ensure them, and must allocate time and resources for this work. Only then is there a chance that capacity development for resilience can become the key tool for sustainable development it has been intended to be since the beginning of the process of capacity development, which again is location specific, location specific, location specific, which means culture specific as well, hazard specific, risk specific, right? So reading the conclusions from the the second edition, we'll then read in the next podcast the conclusions from the first edition. Capacity development is nothing new just because we started to call it that in the last decade or so. Its intellectual roots date back to the 1950s, and although we have learned a lot from over the decades, much of the theoretical underpinnings are still similar. So even in the 1950s, it became a codified pursuit of research and interpretation, theoretical framework, and so on. But before that, adaptation has always happened. Human beings have migrated and changed diets and lifestyles to adapt to changing climates for millennia or centuries or even a million years, but we call it adaptation now in the climate context, climate change context. And similarly, capacity development has happened by doing soft and hard structures to deal with the changing hazards as well and the changing risks. So the periodic name changes for what we now call capacity development have, in other words, been more a reaction to poor implementation in practice than anything else. Considering the continuously poor results of much capacity development, it's interesting to speculate how long we will use this name to describe our efforts to support other actors in developing their capacities. However, I hope the concept is here to stay and that we focus our frustration and efforts on doing what we are supposed to do in theory, instead of wasting more energy by continuing this seemingly perpetual renaming exercise. Renaming always distracts attention because a new bandwagon forms. Remember, we talked about the bandwagon effect. A lot of research efforts go in that direction, a lot of publications come out, a lot of comparisons are made with the previous framework, and it's all to show that we did something new and not really to see what the actual impacts on the ground would be if we use this new name. Okay, so ad hoc and short-term activities do not suffice regardless of what we call the initiatives. Instead, capacity development for resilience entails holistic and systematic action that addresses all significant parts and links in the causal chains behind particular challenges. It must address these challenges on all necessary levels, including developing knowledge, skills, tools, and other resources, organization on all levels, rules and regulations, and other formal institutions, and norms, values, and other informal institutions. To be able to do so, a capacity development initiative must be designed, implemented, and evaluated with attention to dependencies in both the human environment system in question and the capacity development initiative as such. There are many versions and adaptations of the original logical framework analysis that are valuable tools for accomplishing that, given that they are applied with explicit consideration of complexity, uncertainty, ambiguity, and dynamic change, which we discussed in detail. The guidelines suggested in this chapter are intended to help with this process. Finally, capacity development is better approached as a double design problem in which the first design loop focuses on designing, implementing, and evaluating sets of activities to develop the abilities of the human environment system to perform particular functions for resilience, and the second design loop focuses on designing, implementing, and evaluating sets of activities with the explicit purpose of engendering the preconditions necessary for capacity development to work, so that the first loop is not just a theoretical implementation that sits in reports, as we saw in that prop about a cabinet or a shelf with lots of folders, but that you have the preconditions to get started and keep going with the capacity to increase resilience. That way, capacity development has a much better chance of becoming the crucial process for sustainability of humankind, asserted in the current global frameworks under all these nice UN reports that we keep getting. Okay, so this is the end of additional material from the second edition, and I will come back and add the next podcast, which is again reading conclusions from the first edition, which has obviously a lot of overlaps, but the wordings are different because here it's organized slightly differently, just moving away from the major ships and so on to designing and mutual learning and the other topics that we looked at, which escapes my mind right now, but you have it in podcasts. Okay, so see you in the next podcast on the conclusion from the first edition.